What is labor? Where I come from, there are two kinds of work, blue collar and white collar. You've probably heard these terms before, but what do they actually mean? The origins of the blue collar, white collar dichotomy harken back to the early 1900s. During this period, those working in administrative, clerical, or otherwise office-based work were known for wearing white-collared dress shirts. In contrast, those working in factories, mines, or other more manual professions often wore blue-collared uniforms. These uniforms were usually denim or another dark, durable, harder to stain material. Author Upton Sinclair is actually credited with first making this observation and subsequent distinction. His acclaimed novel, The Jungle, notably portrays the struggles of blue-collar individuals working in a pre-regulation meat industry. This era of history, the early 20th century in America at least, saw for the first time this distinction in the types of labor people were doing in order to survive. In modern times, this divide is even greater. The things people do for work no longer fit into these two categories alone. Thusly, new terms have been created over the years to describe different sorts of labor. Louise Kapp Howe coined the term pink collar to describe jobs traditionally held by women, teaching, hospice care, social work. This term has since been expanded to include the broader service industry and jobs like baristas, servers, or retail workers. We've also adopted red collar to describe people who work for the government, and gold collar to describe those working in high-skill, high-earning professions such as doctors and lawyers. And I would of course be remiss to not mention orange collar work, or labor done by those held in jails and prisons. These colors and descriptions, though, they don't really answer the initial question: what is labor? Simply put, labor is the act of putting concentrated effort toward a task or end result. Labor is roughly interchangeable with work in this sense. In economic terms, labor is the act of putting concentrated effort toward a task with the expectation of payment. In a general sense, labor can be physical, mental, or even emotional effort. Of course, not everything we work or labor toward is based around employment and money. Putting effort into a hobby, sport, or personal project also qualifies as labor. Putting emotional effort into building and maintaining relationships is work. Perhaps you've heard someone call a passion project a labor of love. Obviously, these aren't what we would call jobs, but they do count as labor. For our purposes, though, I want to focus specifically on labor done for employment. No matter the color of your collar, if you fit into any of the pigmented professions mentioned beforehand, you are doing labor. You are working. What I want to discuss today is what it is actually like to work. How does the type of work you do influence you as a person, or where we find ourselves in society? How is labor valued, and how is it coordinated? And, importantly, what do we gain from our own labor? I'm Jourdain, and this is See for Yourself. In the roughly 18 years since I got my first job, I have done white, blue, pink, and orange collared work. I started in fast food and restaurants, briefly flirting with both retail and office work before heading into the local steel mill when I was about 21. Since then, with the exception of the work I did in prison, all of the jobs I've held have been primarily in manufacturing and construction. I've had positions that ranged from supervisory to machine operation to literally shoveling rocks all day. That proverbial jack of all trades, master of none. But hey, better than a master of one, am I right? In my own mind, at least, I have extensive experience with labor from various vantage points. I'm sure this is why I find the subject of work and some of the contemporary discourse surrounding it so interesting. In a very tangible sense, work is the dominant factor in our lives. We are not only constantly laboring toward an ideal home and personal life, but most of us also spend a literal third of our adult lives laboring in the name of employment. In addition to requiring focused effort, labor also has some other immutable characteristics. Labor requires the devotion of time, for example. Whether it's 30 minutes of work to change your own oil or 8 hours a day, 5 days a week to earn a salary, you must designate a time to accomplish the work. In addition to time, you are also sacrificing finite physical, mental, or emotional energy in the name of the task or job at hand. When we perform labor for ourselves or others, we are essentially making an exchange, a portion of our time, our life, a portion of our energy, our resources for something in return. You might have built something for yourself to use, so in return you get the completed project. Perhaps you labored for the benefit of a loved one or for charity, in return receiving the satisfaction that comes from helping others. I think it's fair to assume, though, that for most of us, the majority of the labor we do is with the intention of receiving a paycheck in exchange. In this way, we are basically selling our labor, seeing as we are exchanging it for money. To that end, I want to take a few minutes to talk about what labor has been like for me, working in traditionally blue-collar jobs for most of my adult life. At the time I wrote this, which is admittedly a couple months before actually recording this, the Biden administration had recently announced a partial forgiveness on all student loans. This had seemingly ignited an indignance from some in the name of blue-collar workers. Because those in these professions are not traditionally college educated, it is claimed that the elite degree-having crowd are benefiting in a way that working-class folks just aren't. Now, that never went through, and it's not clear if it ever will, and this episode isn't even about student loan forgiveness, so I'm not going to spend any more time on this notion alone. Suffice to say that even if they did institute it, and even if they put in some kind of new tax to cover the loss, which they wouldn't, our taxes go towards things that don't directly benefit us all the time. My taxes pay for roads I may never drive on, subsidies that help corporations. My property taxes fund a school system that my kid doesn't attend and likely never will. I don't give a shit, and it's kinda petty to do so. What I'm actually interested in regarding all of this is the weird sort of idealization / fetishization certain folks seem to have for blue-collar work. In a lot of cases, at least from what I've seen, work they've clearly never done. They want to speak up, quite patronizingly at times, for the people they see as blue-collar, manual laborers, the uneducated, under or extremely well paid, depending on who you ask, backbone of industry. So let's take a few minutes to talk about what blue-collar work is actually like, and then we can talk about how it differs or relates to other types of labor. Most of the work I've done has been in the steel industry and other similar factories. This is about as bare bones manufacturing as it gets. The facilities I've worked at go from the ground up, producing finished, packaged steel or other products from raw materials, often in a foundry or similar setting. When people think of difficult blue-collar work, This is probably one of the first industries that pop into their minds. And I'm not gonna lie, it is hard work. It's mostly physical, with many hazards to avoid and protocols to follow. However, you might be surprised to know that a significant portion of jobs held in this field can still require a college degree. In fact, I've worked with loads of people in factories who had degrees, some of them applicable to their jobs, others not. Many educated professionals still choose the blue-collar route for varying reasons. Often entering industrial fields with an applicable degree can guarantee a fast route to a high-earning position. Even those with degrees in other fields often gravitate to blue-collar work for the earning potential. We can talk about exactly what that earning potential is in a moment, but I want to talk about another reason individuals who themselves might not strike you as blue-collar still choose blue-collar jobs over other career options. And that's a genuine preference for physical labor. As a matter of fact, this is the reason I have pursued blue-collar work over the few other routes that I've been presented with. I have worked in service. I've worked in an office with my own desk, but I still prefer to go into a swelteringly hot, grease and dust-coated factory to sell my labor. Another part of the discourse around the work I've stumbled upon is the belittling of certain types of labor, usually office and service workers. I'm sure we've all either heard or held the notion ourselves, unfortunately, that certain professions aren't real jobs. That things like fast food, waiting tables, or clerical work isn't really labor. It's a starter job. As someone who's done all of the above, I believe those forms of labor are more difficult for me to complete than, say, shoveling rocks or changing a part on a machine. Those jobs require mental and emotional labor, especially in the case of service, where you are directly interfacing with the public. For me, it is more taxing on my energy to do mental and emotional work than it is to do physical work. Plenty of others feel the same way. There is no need to place the labor of one individual in a more strenuous category than another based on whether the work is or isn't physical. Though we can discuss later the instances where entire job and career positions truly are not work, let's at this time focus on the ones that are. I've worked in hot and greasy kitchens and hot and dusty mills. I've done computer work and I've ran a mobile crane. Each one of these jobs was a specific type of labor that I was trained to do. Honestly, to this day, I say that working in a fast food restaurant is 10 times harder than running a forklift or shoveling. I found myself in a consistently worse state of mental and physical health working retail or fast food than I do running machinery all day. I say this only to express difficulty of labor has nothing to do with expenditure of physical energy. Now certainly, I am aware of numerous jobs at the facility where I work that I know I could not physically do. There are very demanding positions that are reasonably occupied by large, strong individuals. However, there is plenty of labor to be done that requires more than brute strength. Labor, at large, is divided into so many professional routes, not just out of necessity for certain products and services, but because different people have forged vocational routes out of a desire to do labor that they enjoyed, were good at, or at least found bearable or satisfying in some way. People have different skills and have applied those toward professions, because the actual necessity is to make money in order to survive. Now, let's be clear. This idea does not constitute a reality where there is an abundance of jobs where we all are free to apply our own individual talents in any profession that we like. It's actually quite the opposite, as I'm sure you're aware. The town I lived in, for example, only gave direct access to employment in certain industries. There's something like 10 large-scale factories in the area where I grew up. If you don't have a degree and you want to make slightly more than you could working at Walmart or McDonald's, chances are you'll end up in one of these factories. If you're wondering how much more slightly is, let's go back to that aforementioned earning potential. Assuming you are just entering the profession for the first time, there are a few factors that contribute to how much you might make. Like I said before, if you come into the field with a relevant degree, you could probably expect to make okay money. Likewise, if you have some sort of trade certification, which we will talk a bit more about in a second. However, if you're coming in fresh with no degree, certifications, training, or applicable skills, there is a good chance you won't get hired directly onto these factories themselves, which limits your earning potential. See, a lot of factories, warehouses, and construction sites have a sort of quiet food chain to the staffing structure. The larger facilities and projects tend to only fill about half the needed positions with full-time company employees, at least in my experience. The other half is usually filled by temp-to-hire workers, staffing agencies, and contractors. And in this case, contractors aren't so much like individual tradesmen like plumbers or carpenters, but smaller companies that are contracted to fill positions long term. And to be transparent, all of the work I've done in the steel industry up until now has been in contracting. I've worked for a smaller company that employed me within a larger facility. Some of these contracted jobs included painting, running equipment like cranes and forklifts, and even janitorial work. Traditionally, all of the operations in places like this are managed by full-time company employees, and these employees do tend to make a decent salary and receive solid benefits. Contractors, not so much. The whole point of using staffing agencies and contractors is to save money. So the salaries are lower and the benefits are typically worthless. It's not all bad though. Contracting is the #1 way to gain experience in a facility like that and eventually move up to a full-time company employee. That experience isn't free though. You get it by selling your labor for lower wages during that period. And this isn't for everyone, and it doesn't always guarantee you a spot at the table, so to speak. You can make a good living working for contractors, don't get me wrong. But if you're contracting at a factory, I can almost guarantee you aren't being paid what you're worth, even if you are doing relatively easy labor. Let's briefly go back to those professional certifications for a second. If you have ever existed on planet Earth, I'm sure you have heard someone espouse the validity of trade school over college. After all, jobs in these fields are essential. They keep the lights on, the wheels turning. People in skilled trade can usually access higher paying jobs pretty quickly after training and certification, especially compared to those with college degrees, depending on the field. And largely, I would agree with most of this as an idea. Having more people certified in trades is a good thing. Giving young people another option after high school is a good thing. However, it's not an either-or situation for me. College isn't for everyone. A degree in a high-paying field can often cost loads more than a certification in an equally high-paying field. It usually also takes more time to get a college degree, but I would argue The trades aren't for everyone either, nor should they be. It isn't necessary for everyone to do physical work, and we don't really need them to. Not only that, but there is also a reason a lot of degree-requiring fields exist in the first place. That being, those professions are equally needed and or desired as the skilled trades. And trade school isn't as easy of an option as you might think. A full program could run you anywhere from $5,000 to $15,000, $20,000, money that you might not just have lying around if you're currently in a low-wage position. They also require a dedicated amount of time, presumably away from your job, as does college, while presumably using that job to finance your program. That being said, a lot of employers, trade unions, and schools themselves offer free certifications and different types of financial aid to those who qualify. If you work for one of these or are near a school with good trade programs, maybe look into them. No matter what position you fill and how much money you make though, working in a factory or on a construction site does kind of suck. It is physically tiring. You do get dirty. You can get small and sometimes large injuries. I don't mind it so much. But why do people have such an apparent admiration for manual labor in the first place? Is it merely out of an appreciation for what that labor provides? Or do they have some sort of fantasy of doing the labor themselves and thus being worthy of their own reverence? Either way, I don't really care. I find it pretty weird to look up or down upon a person for filling one of a million crucial roles in society, especially if that person is yourself. In a very concrete way, those of us who sell our labor for a living have far more in common than not. Around 50 to 60% of Americans work hourly or salaried for an employer, 70% of those jobs being in the service sector. An additional 50 million freelance and 15 million are self-employed, 75% of those being sole proprietors of their operation. The overwhelming majority of us are regularly performing some sort of labor that we sell to someone else in order to meet our needs. This is something most all of us have in common. Our labor facilitates our livelihood. Our work allows us to meet the monetary demand of existence. Even though this is something we all have in common, the way our labor is valued differs greatly. Why is that, though? The simple answer is that certain jobs produce more value in the market than others because of demand, cost of product, skill set, etc. However, this isn't necessarily always the case. After all, something like fast food is a megalithic industry, both in demand and in profit. The products are cheap, but sold in enough volume to rake in huge amounts of money, yet the people who labor to actually prepare and serve the meals are still paid a substandard wage. Why is their labor not valued as much? The invisible hand of the market has made it clear. Fast food is an outright necessity. So why don't we treat its professionals as such? If your labor isn't valued by how much money it actually produces, how is it valued? Well, a few careers pay well because of their importance in society, like doctors and engineers. A few are paid well because of their perceived importance in society, like lawyers and politicians, and others because of the hazards that come with the job, like oil rig workers or utility linemen. And sure, you could make the argument that these vocations do deserve a premium. But should workers that don't fit these criteria be thought of as somehow less important? I would still emphasize that anyone who actively works for a living is largely in the same boat. Most workers do not own large amounts of property or assets that grow their wealth. They rely on their own labor, whatever category it falls under, to provide for them. We all go perform our roles, and we are all mostly fulfilling an important part. Of course, there are those who temporarily or permanently cannot work, or maybe find themselves unemployed, and I would wager that these folks are too in the boat with us. The majority of Americans are closer to those individuals' financial situations than they might care to imagine, especially those of us that sell our labor for a living. I mean, what if you were suddenly unable to perform labor? On that notion, let's start to distinguish what actually isn't work, if only to further make clear what labor actually looks like. Remember earlier when I mentioned entire jobs that aren't actually work? Well, these usually fall into one of two categories. The first, I think, was best described by the late David Graeber in his book, Bullshit Jobs. Graeber posits that a large portion of jobs that people hold are kind of meaningless. Positions where better than half the workday is spent performing no actual labor, but rather looking like they're working. Part of the way we value labor is reflected in the way we abhor those who do not work. Since laboring for money is seen as virtuous in most Western cultures, those of us who do not labor are seen as morally bankrupt. In response to this, Graeber supposes, entire industries, advertently or not, created job positions, not out of our need for the product or money being gained, but simply so more jobs exist. The book alleges something like half of all vocational work is pointless, though I'm not sure I would agree with that estimate. I would agree that it is probably a significant portion, though. Since these bullshit job holders aren't technically doing much labor at all, should we count them as workers? I think it kind of depends on what sort of job they have. Most of what David talks about relates to upper middle management, administration, and corporate activity. People who own or operate large businesses that direct other people's labor. Graeber, and anyone who has ever had a job, probably sees most management operations as ineffective at best. I'm sure we've all had a manager or supervisor that had a bullshit job. I mean, I've had supervisors who spent the day sleeping in their truck and made twice as much as me doing it. And since they were sleeping and all, I think it's pretty obvious that their job isn't exactly necessary for the important labor to get done. A huge issue with these sorts of bullshit jobs, in my opinion, is they tend to create more lower-tiered bullshit jobs. Executives with no experience doing the actual work of the business will create new positions and more work for current employees that often isn't necessary or desired. Think of the sort of job where your assigned tasks are completed in a couple of hours and you spend the rest of the day trying to look busy. The sort of job where you know what you're doing is either unnecessary or could easily be done by another person. The qualifier here, I think, is these positions are usually filled by someone willing and able to work. I've had a job or two like this that I took out of necessity, and for that same necessity, wouldn't have told anyone it was pointless. While I would consider these positions bullshit jobs of sort, I would say that those who fill them are workers, even if they aren't laboring to their desired potential. Those who hold the top tier bullshit jobs, though, I would argue, are not working. It can be debated whether or not the facilitation of work counts as work, but 95% of the time, I'm not buying it. So what is the other category of job that isn't actually labor? Well, owners. And no, I don't mean people who simply own a house or a piece of personal property. I mean those individuals whose entire income is produced not by their own labor, but by simply possessing something worth money. Landlords, factory owners, real estate moguls, those individuals who own the land, resources, materials, and machinery through which workers produce their labor. Through ownership, they are devoid of labor and entitled to a cut of labor produced via them. Here you can make arguments about the groundwork and the risk and the needed capital to facilitate an employment operation. And I will tell you to get wrecked, because that's not what I'm here to talk about, at least not right now. I am merely making these distinctions to further clarify what is labor and who is doing it. See, ownership as a means of income doesn't have a color, nor does upper management and the realm of bullshit jobs, though many of those jobs are in white-collared fields. Even if these positions earn an income in sectors that are reliant upon labor, they do no form of actual labor themselves. Thus, they are without a worker's uniform, and so to speak, their collar has no color. I think that making these distinctions helps us better qualify who is a worker or laborer. And I do this to make the point that unless you hold the position of owner or have a bullshit job, you have far more in common with a worker of a different collar than you may think. Again, we are all on the same side of a very real line, separating those who must sell their labor in order to survive and those who simply do not need to. Even if you have a high-paying job, even if you work in a gold-collar field, chances are you are still heavily reliant upon your labor. There is a very narrow margin of individuals who have survived their entire life on only ownership or other accumulated wealth alone. And outside of these classes, we would all end up in poverty rather quickly if we were not able to sell our labor. And worse, many of us are still in poverty, even as we sell our labor to the highest bidder. While keeping these things in mind, let us venture into what makes different fields unique and why we should change the way we value these jobs entirely, both socially and economically. If you have done any industry hopping as I have, it is pretty apparent that every field has its own sort of culture, even down to individual facilities and businesses. There is literally a social media group or message board for every profession you can think of, each one filled with thousands of highly specific memes and anecdotes. My wife works in a hospital, and I work in a factory. I can't tell you how many times we've exchanged these memes and jokes only to have the other one look back in bewilderment. From my own experience, in white, blue, and pink collar work, I could point out some immediate differences in culture and environment. For example, I would say that pink and, to a lesser extent, white collar work feels a lot more personal. In service work, you are usually directly interacting with one or more members of the public. In a sense, you get to present the results of your labor to the person buying it. Technically, most of the time they're buying it from your employer, but you know what I mean. In blue-collar work, it's a little bit different. Though you might form personal relationships with coworkers, you rarely have direct interaction with the people purchasing the product of your labor. There is a detachment from the labor you're doing and an end result, with maybe the exception of construction or craftsman type positions. In manufacturing especially, it's just one long process of putting your labor toward constant production. I found that the white-collar office jobs I had to fall a bit in the middle. There was a lot of telephone work, talking to the public in that way, but still a bit of disconnect from the final product. I found the general environments of office work to be very competitive, while trying to maintain a sort of faux camaraderie in the workplace. Service work seems to have the fast pace and stress of competition, but with a much more enthusiastic and genuine camaraderie, in my opinion. Again, working in a factory, a little different. People tend to band together to get larger projects done, but mostly stick to small groups when it comes to workplace socialization. When it comes to things like religion, gender, political orientation, race, or other social and ethnic demographics, I've found all the collar colors I've held to be relatively diverse. Though many factories do tend to be mostly male, other demographics are pretty well spread out. Two things sort of happen that really indicate the types of people in these different industries. They either gravitate toward that sort of labor because of their personality and preferences, or they simply find themselves in a job out of necessity and sort of begin to adopt the culture of that workplace. And I am not saying that any of these work environments is inherently better than the other. Quite the opposite, actually. In addition to providing different goods and services, fulfilling different needs and desires, each one of these industries offers a unique culture that might be more appealing to certain individuals. When it comes to work, we are all doing something that society has deemed necessary. And though these designations may come and go with time, we are still using our labor to do something that matters to other people. And there, I think, lies the general non-monetary value of labor. If our fellow humans have said, here is a thing I desire or need and I am willing to pay for it, we are assisting each other in fulfilling that labor. This is one of the most tangible ways we help each other, whether we see the immediate effects or not. Whether you are a doctor, artist, teacher, masseuse, cook, barista, accountant, entertainer, welder, or anything in between, chances are your profession existed before you entered it, with the exception of, emerging fields. Regardless, society or individual needs have called into being a type of labor that you eventually came to fulfill. All labor is equally valid and valuable under this principle. I understand that doctors save lives and baristas prepare drinks, but it is clear by the sheer number of both that they are each desired greatly by the public. Now you could argue, sure, that in the grand scheme of things, some professions exist out of actual necessity for life, while others might just be for convenience. I mean, we've got to have doctors, presumably things like teachers, firefighters, and other critical professions for the sake of survival. These jobs do require extensive training and expertise to be done correctly and safely. You could, technically, harvest and prepare all of your own meals without a lot of technical training. Civilization could carry on without restaurants, cafes, flight attendants, etc., much more easily than it could carry on without medical professionals, scientists, and educators. However, I think it's pretty clear we can have both. Everyone can't and shouldn't have a critical position. Surely, thanks to those positions, civilization has reached a point where we can begin to apply our labor in new and more creative ways. Since we have very clearly shown that we all sort of want things like fast food and the broader service industry to remain around in some form, even if they could stand to be changed, I think we should value those that work in those fields a bit more. And not just because of what their labor gives us, but as I said before, because those jobs have their difficulties as well. There is a reason people are willing to pay others to cook and perform services. They don't want to do that labor themselves. Sometimes they can't. It's too difficult, too time-consuming, too inconvenient for their lives, doesn't fit into their work schedule. We all presumably work in a spectrum of fields with a rainbow of collar colors. And more importantly, we all constantly interact with other workers outside of our own jobs. Each of us is a regular consumer of white, blue, gold, pink, red, and whether you know it or not, orange-collared work. We shop in retail stores, we dine at restaurants, we ideally see a doctor sometimes. The products we consume are made by manufacturers. The buildings we inhabit are made by construction workers. All business operations are usually being directed from some sort of an office. And a surprising amount of labor from prisoners is employed in all of these fields. Obviously, we are invariably intertwined with the government and its employees. Outside of the blue, white, and orange collar examples, we regularly interact with workers in those fields while they are actively laboring. I think there is something to be had in sharing a mutual appreciation for each other and the work that we circulate. On a massive global scale, we are interconnected to workers of every kind from all over the world. We are both the producers and the consumers of the majority of labor. In this, again, we are all alike. Socially, we can very easily begin to change the way we value each other's labor. You can still think some jobs are cooler, more important, or harder in certain ways than others, but you can also respect and value all worker contributions equally. We all take the same roughly 30 to 60 hours a week out of our lives to do labor that we're mostly selling to someone else. And we all have lives that exist outside of this labor as well. As workers, we are all in a similar balancing act of labor and personal time. This balance differs between us, but it exists nonetheless. Luckily enough, it doesn't take any labor to appreciate and respect another person's work. It takes zero effort to show consideration, zero effort to apply value to someone's work in a social sense. I can easily show a server, cashier, doctor, teacher, or fellow factory worker the same amount of appreciation. In that appreciation comes solidarity, a bond that literally reaches across all barriers, if only due to the economic need to sell our labor to each other. Assuming I didn't scare you off by saying worker and solidarity in the same sentence, let's talk about why this mutual appreciation is important. Before we can talk about how labor is valued monetarily, we need to further understand why it is seemingly undervalued socially. The reason I stress the unifying qualities of labor is because of the visible division among workers themselves. People tend to look down upon others and themselves based on their perceived position within the collar hierarchy. Reverence is saved mostly for the gold and white collar professions, with some scraps saved for the top earners in red and blue collared fields. Service work in general seems to be viewed as bottom tier, discounting the unemployed, disabled, and prison workers, of course. And by the way, I know I haven't really gone into my orange collar experiences at all. That's because I'm saving that for a later episode I'll be doing on prison. I only worked in prison for about 8 months, so I'll save that limited experience for a larger video. Coming back to this collar hierarchy though, I think it's pretty apparent that it isn't entirely meritocratic. nor did it arise from nowhere. Part of the reason this system of value exists, socially and economically, is born out of the work culture we live in the first place. That American work ethic you hear so much about. I would argue that certain positions are not higher on the collar tier because of importance, difficulty, or skill, but because the individuals that find themselves in these positions self-inflate their own importance out of fear of being valued less as a worker. What I'm saying is, we don't just give more money to higher earning, more respected individuals simply because they deserve it, but often because we've been told they deserve it. Think about those bullshit jobs we talked about. They can't just let people know that they do nothing all day. Before all things, they must self-preserve. They do this by making sure we think as a culture that they are indispensable. This sort of influence has created a chain reaction over decades that has artificially changed the way we value certain forms of labor. After all, part of the way these individuals show their value is by devaluing others. Now, to be clear, when we are talking about actual workers, I don't think this is the case. Only that in order for this class of non-workers to justify its place at the top of the pyramid, it must create an entire hierarchy underneath itself. Parts of this hierarchy, again, doctors, scientists, etc., will always seem reasonably enough placed. This is part of the cell, but the few truths don't justify the bigger lie that the system shows us who is valuable. It simply does not. Color can be a useful way to categorize the type of labor being done, but it is too often used as a division in class and status. The truth is, there are really only two categories that matter in the grand scheme of things when it comes to collar color. There are those who do labor to survive and those who do not. If you have a collar at all, if you sell your labor, you are a worker, and you should be appreciated for that alone. Even though I have a lot of experience with labor, I am not an economist or a sociologist. Like I said before, I'm just a factory worker. And as we get into the murkier waters of how labor is valued monetarily, I just want to leave that reminder. So, save for certain creative professionals, freelancers, and skilled trade contractors, most of us rarely sell our labor directly to another consumer. Those kinds of fields allow workers a relative say in the amount they charge for their labor, or the product thereof. The rest of us, however, are usually required to sell our labor to an employer at a fixed rate. Employers, in this way, act as a sort of middleman between our labor and the larger market. They provide the facilities and resources to create a product or service, which they intend to sell to the public. Because of demand, time, or difficulty, they outsource the actual work to other individuals. This is how businesses, large and small, employ people. There is money to be made by their product or service, and they need extra people to complete the labor. What is interesting about this relationship is the way employers decide the monetary value of said labor. When a worker sells their labor directly to a consumer, the worker has a general say in how much they will charge. There are definitely averages across industries that will influence this price a great deal, but if a worker knows they are offering a higher quality of work, they may be able to negotiate a higher price from the buyer. Given, this usually has to fall within an accepted range, but there is some room to play. In traditional employment situations, this isn't really the case. Most employers use a company-wide pay scale that isn't based so much on skill or quality of labor necessarily, but on length of time at the company or job title. As an employee, though salary negotiations are possible, they are not always welcome. It is rare, in my experience, for a company to deviate from its pre-designated pay structure. And unfortunately, these pay structures tend to give less value to your labor as time goes on. We know why companies hire employees, but let's talk about how they are actually able to do this. I'm sure I'm not blowing any minds by saying that the primary focus of 99% of employers is to first make a profit. So even though your labor is essential to doing this, they must be able to purchase it at a price that leaves room for said profit. This makes sense, right? I mean, why invest in a business in the first place? Why pay people to labor if you aren't making a little something in return? I'm sure there are products and services out there that were designed solely to make people's lives better. And I'm sure there are businesses that have formed around these products and services simply to facilitate getting those life-improving things to more people. However, the designers and facilitators of these things have to eat too. So whatever they are offering, they need to be able to make an income off the top. Again, this sounds reasonable. The issue here is that people aren't always reasonable. In my experience, the more a person's unreasonable behavior goes unchecked, the less reasonable it becomes. Again, I don't think I'm being sensational when I say that those with more money can get away with being a bit less reasonable than those without. What this translates to is employers becoming less reasonable in the way they value the labor of their employees. There is a paradigm that is intrinsic to the economic system we find ourselves living in called infinite growth. Essentially, the current economic system does not simply allow a business to maintain a stable set margin of profit. In the competitive economic environment, money made by a different business is money lost by yours. Simply, a business must always be competing, and thusly, always growing. Further, the more successful a business is, the bigger its profit margins must grow. As these things expand, they creep into new modes of competition and more growth, hence infinite growth. If your business in this sort of economy cannot grow infinitely, it will inevitably fail. And this doesn't only apply to individual businesses as they go throughout their lifespans, but demands infinite growth from the bottom up as well. This means you have to nearly guarantee larger profit margins to even start a business today than you would have 20 years ago. And not just more profit from the beginning, but more volume as well. More, unfortunately, this alleged growth requires its nutrients from the very bottom of the employment pyramid, the workers. Basically, all economic growth is actually contingent upon what we'll call, say, the surplus value of your labor. As time goes on, in this infinite growth model, your labor technically becomes more and more valuable. Let's be clear though, this does not mean that what you are paid for your labor reflects that value. Surplus value can be thought of as the actual market value of whatever you have produced in a given work period. If you're a McDonald's cook and you prepare an average of 50 Big Macs in an hour, discounting any other food that you might have prepared in that period, your labor has facilitated the accumulation of about $200. Now let's be fair and say that yourself and one drive-through attendant each did half the labor involved in the transaction. you've each earned the company about $100 in 1 hour. Removing what McDonald's themselves claims to be the cost of production, which is 77 cents per Big Mac, you've each still made the company, theoretically, about $80.75. Assuming you're making a generous average of $12 an hour, while data actually indicates the real average for fast food workers is closer to $8, that leaves you with $68.75. This $68.75 is the surplus value of your labor relative to an hour's work. That surplus value is what your employer would call profit. In the last 50 years, the surplus value of the average job and its subsequent company profits have increased exponentially. Unfortunately, the rate we are paid for our labor has not. When I say that any given worker is not paid what they are worth, this is what I mean. Our employment itself is contingent upon our wages staying significantly lower than the ever-growing profit margin our labor is producing. Because of this system, we have no choice but to accept a portion of what our labor is actually worth. The hierarchies of collar color, the bullshit jobs, they exist primarily to reinforce this system of growth. If we can't get people to produce more for less, the growth might potentially stop. The ways in which we are conditioned to view our labor, the labor of others, and the act of laboring itself are all designed to uphold a system that drains financial and social value from the work we do. When we idolize one profession or look down upon another, we actively participate in the suppression of our own individual value. These conditions are what have caused the commodification of art and creativity and stifled innovation. The more we expand this system of value, the less worth we will receive from our labor. This is why I wanted to stress so much what it means to labor, what it's like to work for a living, because all aspects of it emphasize the need to start stepping outside of this system. When we have solidarity, not just in individual workplaces and industries, but as laborers in all fields, we can much more clearly see where we all presently stand. As workers, we are all on the bottom of the pyramid. When it comes to the value contained in the larger economic system, 90% is held at the top. The collective surplus value of our labor has been siphoned toward the small percentage of the population that does no actual labor. Assuming you've made it this far, I'm hoping you'll agree that we need to change fundamentally the way we value labor. I think the way to begin would be changing the way we view labor personally, both the labor we do and the labor done by others. When we collectively agree that all labor is worthy of respect and of relatively equal social value, we could further agree that as workers, we should be entitled to a larger portion of the surplus value of our own labor. If a barista and a machine operator are both generating $100 pure profit in an hour, shouldn't these each receive a fair share of that profit? Even taking into account the financial investment and risk of an employer, surely there is a point in their growth where the collective employees have repaid that risk, if not several times over. To be clear again, I do not think I'm suggesting anything radical here. If an employer can make a profit from the labor of an individual, that employee should be paid a livable wage. Honestly, if you can't afford to pay a livable wage, your business doesn't need to grow. One person should not aspire to grow their life via the devalued labor of another. That is simply taking advantage of another person. I also don't find it a stretch to say that wages should not only be livable, but should reasonably reflect their market value. Whatever the surplus value of your labor is, you should be entitled to a portion that is at least consistent with what your employer is taking in profit. I'm not saying changing the way we value labor economically will magically fix this top-heavy hierarchy. Changing the way we view it socially will likely have a bigger impact, but the entire economic system of employment and labor would require a drastic redesigning to permanently address the problem. That being, the current system is set up to barricade us from the value of our own labor. This is done not only through employers and corporations, but by the very culture that we exist in. We rarely have an appropriate level of appreciation for labor, others or our own. We look too far up or down, wagering different values driven by perceptions of worth, difficulty, and importance. Without finding solidarity as laborers, we perpetuate our own minimization. In short, I recommend practicing this in your own life. Address and investigate the systems of value you place on your own labor, and then the labor of others. Do you know the surplus value your labor produces? What you're paid? Whether you even think it's fair or why? Do you have the same knowledge about any other fields of labor? If you don't already, try genuinely appreciating the workers you encounter in your professional and personal lives. Examine what they contribute and what that provides for people. Try to realize that everyone is laboring for the same reason, to improve or prolong their life. When you go into a store or restaurant, use a service, or visit a business, ask yourself what these things provide you. If you find appreciation for the service or product, extend that to the people laboring to make it possible. To me, this is just being nice, doing the right thing, empathizing with other people and caring for ourselves in the process. In a world that produces so much abundance via labor, can we not all indulge in the fruits of it? I know I didn't touch on everything and left out entire fields and professions, but I hope this provided a general sense of the point I was trying to make. You don't have to be colorblind. Just don't hasten to create unnecessary divisions among workers. Oh, and maybe take some steps to organize and or unionize your own workplace. If you still have doubts, think that not all labor is valuable, and think that the current system is operating just fine, I invite you to further examine not only my experiences, but the experiences of others. When it comes to labor, there's little replacement for some hands-on knowledge. Sometimes you have to roll up your sleeves, get your clothes a little dirty, and see for yourself.